The discrepancy on the ledgers was small, a mere 3% variance in the shipping logistics column. But to Dante Moretti, it screamed like a siren in a silent room. He sat in the high-backed leather chair of his office, the glow of 3 monitors casting sharp shadows across his face. It was 2:23 a.m. The rest of New York City might have been sleeping or drowning in the storm that raged outside, but Dante was dissecting the anatomy of a betrayal. 3% didn't happen by accident. 3% was theft, disguised as incompetence, and he despised nothing more than a thief who lacked the courage to look him in the eye. He minimized the spreadsheet, the headache behind his eyes pulsing in time with the distant thunder rolling over Manhattan. His penthouse, a fortress of glass and steel perched 52 stories above the chaos of Central Park West, usually offered him clarity. Tonight it felt suffocating. The air conditioning hummed a low, sterile note that grated on his nerves. He needed water. He needed to step away from the digital evidence of disloyalty before he decided which of his capos would answer for it in the morning. Pushing away from the obsidian desk, Dante stood and stretched, the expensive fabric of his black dress shirt straining across his shoulders. At 37, he had built an empire from blood and calculated violence, yet the only battles that kept him awake anymore were fought in spreadsheets and whispered betrayals. He walked out of the office and into the hallway. The residence was dark, illuminated only by the faint ambient city light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a space designed for intimidation, not comfort, minimalist, cold, and echoing with the kind of silence that money bought. No photographs on the walls, no personal touches, nothing that revealed the man who lived here, because Dante Moretti had learned long ago that revealing anything was weakness. The staff had been dismissed hours ago. The chef, the housekeepers, the assistants, they operated on a strict schedule that ensured Dante never had to interact with the domestic machinery of his own life. He preferred it that way. Invisibility was the highest standard of service. He reached the top of the floating staircase that spiraled down to the main living area. He took the first step, his bare feet silent on the polished stone, intending to head straight for the wet bar. But he stopped. A sound drifted up from the open-concept kitchen below. It was a soft, rhythmic scraping, not the mechanical hum of an appliance, but the deliberate human noise of plastic against metal. Dante froze. His hand didn't go for a weapon. He was in his own home behind 3 layers of biometric security, but his body shifted instantly into a state of predatory alertness. The transition was seamless, instinctive, the product of 2 decades in a world where hesitation meant death. He hadn't authorized any overtime. The night cleaning crew wasn't due until tomorrow. He moved to the railing, looking down into the cavernous kitchen. A single light was on, the under-cabinet LED strip above the main island, casting a warm, a focused pool of gold amidst the shadows. There was a woman standing there. Dante narrowed his eyes, adjusting to the gloom. He recognized the uniform immediately, the slate-gray dress with the modest white collar, the standard attire for the day staff. It was Alara Bennett. He knew her name because he made it his business to know the identity of every single person who breathed the same air as him. He knew she was 28, that she had been hired 4 months ago to replace his retiring housekeeper, and that her background check had flagged significant debt, $192,000, to be precise, though no criminal record. There had been an arrest 2 years prior, charges dropped, something about a drug operation she claimed ignorance of. His security team had recommended rejection. Dante had approved her clearance anyway. Debt made people desperate for work. Desperate people worked hard. And something in her file, the dead father, the absent mother, the long string of jobs that never lasted, had caught his attention in a way he couldn't quite articulate. But she wasn't working. Dante descended the stairs, hugging the wall where the shadows were deepest. He stopped at the bottom, hidden by the partition of the living room, giving him a direct line of sight to the island. Alara was hunched over the counter. She looked smaller than he remembered from the brief glimpses he'd caught of her in the hallways, a ghost who cleaned and vanished, who never met his eyes, who moved through his home like she was afraid to leave footprints. Her auburn hair, usually pinned back in a severe professional bun, was fraying at the edges, loose strands falling across her forehead. The color was dull, lifeless, the kind of hair that came from years of poor nutrition. She looked exhausted. No, exhausted was too mild a word. She looked hollowed out, her shoulders slumped with a weight that seemed to press her down toward the marble, her frame so thin that her collarbones jutted out above the collar of her uniform like the ridges of a skeleton. On the counter in front of her sat the heavy copper roasting pan from his dinner. Chef Marcello had prepared a rack of lamb tonight, enough to feed 6 men. Dante had eaten 3 bites before losing his appetite to the ledger sheets. The rest, pounds of high-quality, Perfectly cooked meat, surrounded by roasted vegetables and herbs, was destined for the trash. His instructions were strict. No leftovers. Fresh start every day. Ilara held a plastic container in one hand, a cheap, clouded thing that looked like it had been washed 1,000 times, the edges worn soft from use. In her other hand was a plastic spatula. She wasn't stealing the silverware. She wasn't raiding the liquor cabinet for vintage scotch. She wasn't photographing documents or planting listening devices. She was stealing his garbage. Dante watched, fascinated and disturbed, as she worked with surgical precision. She scooped up the slices of cold lamb, arranging them in the container to maximize space. She scraped the congealed fat and juices from the bottom of the pan, drizzling it over the meat as if it were liquid gold. She added the rosemary potatoes, the glazed carrots, packing them into the corners with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Her movements were not greedy. They were reverent. She treated the discarded food with more respect than his wealthy associates treated their million-dollar investments. Each piece was handled with care, placed with intention. This wasn't impulse. This was ritual. Then she paused. Her hand was shaking, trembling, really, as she reached for a piece of fat that had fallen onto the counter. She hesitated, looking at it. A long moment passed. Her throat moved as she swallowed. Then she quickly popped it into her mouth. She closed her eyes as she chewed, and a look of pure, unadulterated relief washed over her face. Dante felt something crack in his chest. It wasn't pity. He didn't believe in pity. Pity was a luxury for people who had never had to make hard choices, who had never watched the light leave someone's eyes and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of necessity. But watching this woman, this ghost who haunted his hallways, close her eyes over a scrap of fat like it was salvation, this was something else. A sharp jolt of reality. He threw away more food in a day than most people saw in a week. But seeing the physical act of someone salvaging it, someone who worked in his home, who cleaned his floors and folded his sheets and probably pressed her hands against surfaces he touched without ever knowing she existed, that was jarring. That pale face, that expression of relief so profound it bordered on pain. How long since she had eaten a real meal? How many times had she stood in this kitchen after midnight, gathering his scraps like a starving dog? Ilara sealed the container. She wrapped it in a paper towel, then another, likely to mask the smell. She opened a battered canvas tote bag that sat on the floor, faded, patched in 2 places, the strap fraying, and shoved the container deep inside beneath a folded sweater. Then the cleanup began. This was the part that made Dante's eyes narrow. A thief who grabs and runs is acting on impulse. A thief who cleans up the crime scene is calculating. Ilara took the roasting pan to the sink. She didn't just rinse it, she scrubbed it with methodical intensity, removing every trace of grease. She dried it with a cloth, polishing the copper until it gleamed. She placed it in the dishwasher in the exact slot it belonged, positioned precisely as Chef Marcello always left it. She returned to the island, sprayed the counter with disinfectant, wiped it down in slow, careful circles until the marble gleamed like black ice, removing any fingerprint, any grease spot, any evidence that she had been there. She checked her watch, a cheap digital piece with a cracked face, and panic flickered in her eyes. It was late, too late. She grabbed her bag, clutching it to her chest like a shield, and hurried toward the service exit near the pantry. She moved with the silent, practiced gait of someone who had spent her entire life trying not to be seen, someone who had learned, through years of hard experience, that visibility meant vulnerability. The door clicked shut behind her. The kitchen was empty again, pristine, silent, as if she had never been there at all. Dante stepped out of the shadows and walked to the island. He ran a finger across the marble where the pan had been. It was spotless, cool to the touch. If he hadn't been standing there, watching from the darkness like some kind of predator, he would never have known she had taken anything. That was the problem. He stared at the service door, his jaw tight. Why the secrecy if she was hungry? Why not ask? The chef threw this food away every night. Dante had seen the waste logs. Why risk her job, her security clearance, her entire livelihood for leftovers? Unless the desperation ran deeper. Unless there was something she was hiding. Something that went far beyond an empty stomach. His mind, trained to see threats in every shadow, began to spin scenarios. $192,000 in debt, a dead father, an absent mother, an arrest record that didn't quite add up. A woman with that kind of financial pressure was a target, a liability, a crack in his security that any rival family could exploit. If she was sneaking around his house at 2 a.m. to steal lamb, what else could she be pressured to take? How easy would it be for the Volkov organization, those Russian bastards who had been circling his territory like wolves, to offer her $10,000 to slip a listening device under his desk? To photograph the documents he left on the dining table? To report his movements, his meetings, his vulnerabilities? The theft of the food might be nothing, a hungry woman surviving. Or it might be a test, a way to see if she could move through his home undetected. Dante's hands curled into fists at his sides. He thought of her face again. The way she had closed her eyes. The trembling relief. The bones visible beneath her skin. Something didn't add up. He was going to find out exactly who Alara Bennett was, where her debt came from, who held her leash, and exactly what she was running from. And if she was a threat, if she had been planted by Volkov or anyone else, he would destroy her without hesitation. But if she wasn't, Dante turned away from the kitchen, walking back toward the stairs. If she wasn't, then he had just witnessed something he hadn't seen in a very long time. Someone who was barely surviving. Someone who was drowning in silence. Someone who had looked at a piece of discarded fat like it was the only kindness the world had offered her in years. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that bothered him far more than any 3% discrepancy ever could. If you are listening to this and feel that the story touches something quiet and unspoken inside you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video so we can continue bringing heartfelt stories every single day. And if it is not too much to ask, tell me where you are watching from, and leave a comment below, so we know which corner of the world this story has reached, because we treasure every word you share with us. The next morning, when the first light slipped through the enormous glass panes of the penthouse, Dante was already sitting in his office with a cup of cold coffee in his hand. He had not slept. The image of that woman, the way she had closed her eyes while chewing a scrap of fat, kept replaying in his mind like a piece of film stuck on the same frame. At exactly 7 o'clock, Luca Santini walked in, gray suit pressed to perfection, black hair combed straight back. Luca had been Dante's right hand for 12 years, the only man he trusted enough to handle the kind of work that demanded absolute discretion. Dante did not circle around the point. He pushed a sheet of paper across the desk, a printout of an employee badge photograph. Alara Bennett. I want to know everything about her, not the usual background check. I want to know what she eats, where she sleeps, who she owes, and why she was in my kitchen at 2 a.m. stealing leftovers. Luca looked at the picture, then at Dante, his expression carefully guarded. He did not ask why. He did not ask what had happened. He simply nodded and disappeared. The results came that same afternoon, faster than Dante had expected. Luca returned with a leather briefcase full of documents. His face darkened in a way that told Dante whatever lay inside would not be pleasant. They sat facing each other in the office, curtains drawn tight, and Luca began to report. Alara Catherine Bennett, 28 years old, born in Queens. Father, Henry Bennett, construction worker, died 2 years ago in a drunk driving accident. Mother, Catherine Bennett, left when Alara was 9, without a goodbye, without a phone call, vanished as if she had never existed. Dante listened, his face expressionless, but something inside him tightened. Luca went on. After his wife left, Henry Bennett fell apart. He turned to alcohol, then to gambling. He borrowed from off-the-books lenders to feed his habits. Alara grew up in want, had to fend for herself from the age of 11. At 17, she was nominated for a full scholarship to Parsons School of Design. 1 week before the interview, her father lost $20,000 at the tables. She used all the money she had saved for college to pay the debt. She missed the interview. The dream ended there. Luca turned to the next page, his voice dropping a note. At 20, she met a man named Derek Walsh, who called himself a businessman. He conned her, used her as a front for a drug operation. When the police raided the place, Alara was arrested. She was released after 72 hours for lack of evidence. But the arrest record has followed her ever since. No one wants to hire someone with a stain like that. Dante thought of the note in her personnel file, the one security had used to recommend he reject her application. He had ignored it, assuming a person with debts would work harder. He had not imagined the story behind it would be this dark. But what Luca said next was what truly froze Dante. At 24, she got pregnant. The father of the child is unknown. In the 11th week, she miscarried in the bathroom of the bar where she was working. Alone. No one knew. She cleaned up the blood and went back to work because she could not afford to take a sick day. A heavy silence settled over the room. Dante said nothing, but his jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his cheek began to twitch. Luca continued, his tone even, as if reading a death notice. 2 years ago, her father died. 3 days after the funeral, Roman Volkov showed up. Dante's head snapped up at the name. Volkov was a Russian loan shark, the sworn enemy of the Moretti family in Brooklyn, a viper with a gentleman's face and a heart made of frozen stone. Henry Bennett's original debt was $45,000, Luca said. With interest compounding weekly and brutal penalties for every missed deadline, the debt didn't just grow, it exploded. It has ballooned to $192,000. Volkov is forcing Alara to pay in her father's place. In the past 2 years, she has worked 3 jobs, 18 hours a day, and managed to pay $35,000. But because of the interest, the amount she owes has not gone down. It has only grown. Dante understood. She had not stolen food out of greed. She was starving herself to save money, trying to pay off a man who would never allow her to walk free. Luca closed the briefcase and looked straight at Dante with a rare seriousness. She is not a spy, boss. She is prey. Volkov is tightening the noose on her day after day. If you are worried she is a threat, I can assure you she is not. She does not have the strength to be a spy. She is using every last bit of strength just to survive. Dante did not answer. He looked out the window, at Manhattan spread below like a map of money and power. He thought of Alara Bennett, the girl who had lost everything before she ever truly had anything, the girl who had miscarried alone in a public restroom and gone back to work, the girl being strangled by Volkov day after day, and yet still cleaning up so meticulously as if her life depended on every stain she wiped away. And perhaps it really did. Dante rose and walked to the window. "Tonight," he said, his voice hard as steel, "I will talk to her." The following night, Dante did not sit in his office going over the books. He sat in the dark of the living room, in a black leather armchair placed in the most hidden corner, where the light from the kitchen could not reach. He had turned off all the lights at 10 in the evening, ordered security not to intervene no matter what happened, and waited, like a panther watching its prey in the dark. The cup of black coffee in his hand had long since gone cold, but Dante did not drink. He only stared at the kitchen door and waited. 2:15, right on cue, the side door opened with a soft sound so faint that anyone not listening closely would have dismissed it as the wind. But Dante heard it. He heard the whisper-light footsteps moving across the stone floor, the shallow, restrained breathing of someone doing something they knew was wrong but who had no other choice. Alara came into his line of sight, still in the familiar charcoal gray uniform, still with the same dry reddish-brown hair scraped back in a rough tie, still with that body so thin it looked as if a strong gust could sweep her away. She moved like a ghost, switched on the small LED lights beneath the cabinets, and began her midnight ritual. That night Chef Marcello had prepared beef braised in red wine, an expensive dish from which Dante had eaten only a few bites before pushing it away. The rest still lay in a white porcelain dish, waiting to be thrown out in the morning. Dante watched as Alara opened the refrigerator, took out the dish, and began spooning each portion into the battered plastic container he now recognized. Her movements were as meticulous as the night before, as careful as if she were handling pure gold rather than leftovers. She used a spatula to scrape up every trace of sauce from the bottom, not wasting a single drop. And when a piece of carrot fell onto the stone surface, she picked it up at once, wiped it clean with a paper towel, and put it into the box. Dante stood. He stepped out of the darkness with the silence of an assassin, walking toward the main light switch without making a sound. Then he flipped it. White light exploded across the kitchen. Alara let out a short scream and dropped the plastic box in her hand. It hit the marble floor with a flat thud. The lid sprang off, and the braised beef flew everywhere. The dark brown sauce splashed onto the table leg, the hem of her dress, and the worn canvas shoes on her feet. She spun around, eyes wide with terror, and when she saw Dante standing there with a face of ice, all the blood seemed to drain from her face in a single heartbeat. She froze, mouth opening but no sound coming out, like a rabbit caught in the glare of headlights in the middle of a highway. Dante walked toward her, each step slow and measured, every footfall like a countdown to sentencing. He stopped about 6 feet away from her, close enough to see the tremor in her pale green eyes, close enough to smell the industrial cleaner clinging to her uniform, but far enough to maintain the distance of power. "Do you know what the punishment is for stealing in my house?" His voice was level, emotionless, but each word fell into the silent kitchen like a stone made of ice. Alara swallowed, her throat working painfully. "I will clean this up and leave right away." Her voice was hoarse, so soft it was almost a whisper, but she did not beg, she did not cry. She stood there with her shoulders straight, chin lifted just a little, as if even standing at the edge of ruin she still had one last shred of pride to protect. "I did not ask what you would do." Dante tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. I asked if you know what the punishment is. Alara stayed silent, her lips pressed into a thin line, and Dante realized she was fighting to keep herself from shaking. She was afraid, obviously, but she would not allow that fear to show. That interested him more than it angered him. He kept quiet a moment, letting the tension seep into the air, and then he spoke again. But instead of pronouncing a sentence, instead of calling security, instead of doing what any ordinary employer would do when catching an employee stealing, Dante asked another question. A question that hit Alara like a bolt of lightning. How much does Volkov take from you each month? Alara's face, which had already been bloodless, turned the color of ash. Her eyes widened until Dante could see the whites all around the pale green of her irises. She stumbled back a step, her back striking the edge of the kitchen island, and for the first time since he had turned on the lights, she truly lost control. You know, it was not a question. It was the trembling admission of someone who has just realized that every secret they thought they had buried has been dug up. I know everything, Dante replied, his voice still cold, but no longer as sharp as a blade. I know your father was a gambling addict. I know your mother left when you were 9. I know you lost your scholarship to Parsons because you had to pay his debt. He took another step toward her, and Alara flinched as if she were bracing for a blow. I know a bastard named Derek Walsh tricked you into that drug operation. I know you were arrested, spent 72 hours in a cell, and that record closed every door in front of you. He paused, looking straight into her eyes. And I know what happened when you were 24, in the bar restroom, alone. Alara reacted as if someone had punched her in the stomach. She doubled over, one hand clutching the edge of the island to keep from collapsing, and for the first time Dante saw something break in her gaze. Not tears, she did not cry, but something gave way, something she had been building for years to shield herself. How do you know? Her voice was no more than a breath. No one knows about that. No one. Because I needed to know, Dante said. Because when someone slips into my home at 2 a.m, I need to know whether they are a threat or just a person trying to make it through the day. He was silent for a heartbeat, then added, his tone a shade softer, and now I know which one you are. Alara stood there with her back against the kitchen island, looking at Dante as if she were trying to decide whether he was a new enemy or just another kind of danger she had never faced before. The kitchen was suffocatingly quiet, filled only with the steady hum of the refrigerator and the heavy sound of her breathing. Food still lay scattered across the floor, dark brown sauce spreading like an open wound, but neither of them moved to clean it up. Dante pulled a bar stool closer, sat down with the unhurried ease of a man who had all the time in the world, then pointed to the stool across from him. Sit down, tell me. Alara did not sit. She stayed where she was, both hands gripping the edge of the island behind her as if it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Why? Her voice was rough, scraped raw. You already know everything. What more do you need from me? I know the events, Dante replied, his tone even. But I want to hear them from you. I want to understand. Silence stretched out. Alara watched him, wary and searching, as if trying to locate the trap hidden behind that request. Then at last, as if the last of her resistance had drained away, her shoulders slackened and she began to speak. My mother left when I was 9. Her voice was flat, emotionless, like someone reading the morning weather report. I woke up one morning and she just was not there anymore. No goodbye. No note. Just an empty closet and a half-full bottle of perfume on the dressing table. She did not even take the perfume with her. It was like even the scent of her old life was something she wanted to abandon. She paused for a moment, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere behind Dante, on a past only she could see. I waited for her for 3 months. Every night I sat at the window, looking out at the street, waiting for her to come back. She never did. No phone call, no letter. It was like I had never existed in her life at all. What about your father? Dante asked, his voice softer than he had intended. Alara blinked, and for a brief second Dante saw something flicker through those pale green eyes. Pain, buried deep, but still there. My father loved my mother so much that when she left, he fell apart, she said. First it was alcohol, then gambling. He told me he gambled to forget, but I think he gambled because he wanted to lose. Lose money, lose the house, lose everything, like it was his way of punishing himself for not being able to make her stay. She drew in a slow breath, then went on. From the time I was 11, I took care of myself. Cooking, laundry, school, homework. My father was physically in the house, but he was not really there. He was just the shell of the man who had once been my father. And the scholarship? Dante asked. Parsons. Alara's lashes fluttered, quick, as if someone had just slapped her. I was good at drawing, she said. Her voice was still flat, but something trembled at the edges. It was the only thing I was good at. I drew when my mother left. I drew when my father passed out drunk on the floor. I drew when there was nothing to eat and my stomach hurt. When I was 17, I was nominated for a full scholarship to Parsons School of Design. She stopped, and Dante saw her fingers tighten around the edge of the island until the knuckles turned white. 1 week before the interview, my father lost $20,000. Volkov sent his men. They said if we did not pay in 7 days, they would cut off my father's fingers, one by one. She lowered her gaze to the mess on the floor. But Dante knew she was not really seeing any of it. I had $8,000 saved. 10 years of putting money away. Extra jobs, birthday money. What people gave me when my grandmother died. I took all of it, gave it to them, then worked 2 jobs to pay the rest. I missed the interview. The dream ended there. Dante said nothing. He only sat and listened. And somehow that seemed to pull more words from her, as if once she had started, she could no longer stop. When I was 20, I met Derek, she said, shaping the name like it was poison in her mouth. He said he was a businessman. Said he wanted to help me. Said he loved me. She gave a short, harsh laugh with no trace of joy. I believed him because I was too tired to be suspicious, because I wanted someone to care about me, just once. He used me as a front. Rented an apartment in my name, had packages delivered to my address. When the police came, he disappeared. So did my $2,300 of savings, and I was the one who got dragged away in handcuffs in front of the neighbors. You were held for 72 hours, Dante said. It was not a question. Alara nodded. They released me because they did not have enough evidence, but the arrest record stayed. Forever. After that, no one would hire me. No restaurants, no companies, no one. I worked the kinds of jobs that don't ask for background checks. Dishwashing, hotel cleaning, night shifts at bars. She stopped, and Dante saw her shoulders tremble, almost imperceptibly. The bar, she said. That is where it happened. When I was 24, Dante did not ask what. He already knew. But he remained silent, letting her decide whether to say it out loud. And she did. Her voice was as empty as a room without furniture. I got pregnant. I don't know who the father was. I was too tired, too drunk, too desperate to forget everything for just one night. But when I saw the test come back positive, for the first time in years I felt like I had something to live for. She drew in a shuddering breath. Week 11. I was on the night shift. Stomach cramps. Blood. So much blood. I sat on the floor of the bar bathroom, alone, listening to the music pounding outside, and lost the baby. No one knew. No one came. I cleaned up the blood, walked back out, and kept serving drinks because I could not afford to take a sick day. She looked up, straight into Dante's eyes, and he saw no tears in them. Only the emptiness of someone who had been drained dry long ago. 2 years later my father died. 3 days after the funeral Volkov came. He said debt does not die with the debtor. He said I am his blood, so I have to pay. She fell quiet for a moment, then added in a voice as soft as exhaling. And I have paid. For 2 years. Every day, every dollar. But it is never enough. Never. Silence settled over the kitchen after Alara finished speaking. She stood there, hollowed out, as if telling all of that had stripped away the last reserves of energy in her body. Dante looked at her, and for the first time in many years, he did not know what to say. He had heard tragic stories before. In his world, tragedy happened as routinely as breakfast. But there was something about Alara, about the way she told everything in that flat voice without emotion, about those dry eyes that had no tears left to shed, that stirred something inside him he had thought long dead. He stood, walked toward her, and Alara instinctively stepped back, her spine hitting the refrigerator. But Dante did not stop because she was afraid. He stopped because he had made a decision. I will pay off your debt, he said, his voice as steady as if he were giving a weather report. The full $192,000. Alara blinked, her face shifting in an instant from emptiness to suspicion. She looked at him as if he had just spoken in another language, as if those words did not belong in the world she knew. What? You will not owe Volkov anymore, Dante repeated, slower this time, as though explaining something to a child. I will pay all of it for you, every last cent. Starting tomorrow you will be free. Alara shook her head, her eyes narrowing with the wariness of an animal that has been cornered too many times. No one gives anyone anything for free, she said, her voice hardening. What do you want? Dante tilted his head, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly, as if she had just said something that amused him. "Smart," he said. "You are right. I am not a charity. I have conditions." Alara stood very still, waiting, her entire body drawn tight like a string on a bow. She was used to people wanting something. She was used to paying a price for everything. But when Dante finally told her his condition, she could not hide the surprise on her face. "I want you to work for me," he said. "Not as a maid, as a special analysis assistant. For 3 years. Your salary will be 3 times what you earn now. Your job will be to organize data, analyze files, find the irregularities other people overlook." Alara blinked, clearly not understanding. "Analysis? I'm a maid. I clean houses. I don't know anything about data analysis." Dante stepped closer, and this time Alara did not retreat. She stood her ground, looking straight into his eyes with a defiance he had not expected her to still be capable of summoning. "You have spent 2 years staring at every coin, calculating every meal, balancing every expense just to survive," he said, his voice softer. "You didn't just clean, you restored order. You put the pan back in the exact slot, aligned to the millimeter. You wiped the counter in circles to match the marble's grain so no streaks would show. That is not just cleaning, Alara. That is pattern recognition. That is the ability to see when something disrupts a perfect system. And in my world, discrepancies are what get people killed. I need eyes that can see what doesn't belong." Alara stayed silent for a moment, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. Then she spoke, her voice thick with suspicion. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. $192,000 is a lot of money, even for someone like you. Why?" Dante did not answer right away. He turned his back to her, walked toward the window that looked out over Manhattan, sinking into the night, the city lights flickering like a million stars scattered across the ground. "Roman Volkov is my enemy," he said at last, his voice cold as steel. "He has been trying to encroach on Moretti territory for 5 years. He has poisoned my supply lines, bought off my men, and killed 2 capos under me. My paying your debt is not charity, it is a message." He turned back to her. "I want Volkov to understand that anything he thinks belongs to him, I can take away. You are his prey, and I am going to tear you from his jaws right in front of him. That is the reason." Alara studied him for a long time, and Dante could see her weighing, calculating, trying to uncover the trap hidden inside his offer. "So I am just a tool," she said at last, her voice drained of emotion. "A way for you to provoke Volkov. You are an intelligent woman in a desperate situation," Dante replied without flinching. "I am offering you a way out. You can refuse, go back to being a maid, keep paying Volkov until the end of your life and still never be free. Or you can accept my offer, walk away from him, and work for me for 3 years. The choice is yours." Silence stretched between them. Alara looked down at the food still scattered across the floor, then back up at Dante. There was something in her eyes he could not quite read. Weariness, resignation, and perhaps, just perhaps, the faintest flicker of hope that she was trying to hide. "What do I have to sign?" she asked, her voice rough. Dante shook his head. "No signatures. In my world, ink on paper means nothing. People sign 100 contracts and betray them the next day." He stepped closer, stopping directly in front of her, looking into her eyes. "Your word is what matters. You tell me you will work for me for 3 years, and I believe you. If you betray me, I will know. And you know what that means." Alara swallowed, but she did not look away. She held his gaze, and when she spoke, her voice was steadier than he expected. "I agree. 3 years. I will work for you." Dante nodded, and something in his chest loosened, something he did not understand. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow I will see Volkov. You stay home. Don't go anywhere. Don't contact anyone until I return. Understood?" Alara nodded, and for the first time since he had flicked on the lights, Dante saw her shoulders drop, as if a portion of the weight she carried had been lifted. She did not fully believe yet. He knew that. She was still waiting for the trap to spring shut, but at least for tonight she could breathe. And with what she had endured, perhaps that alone was already too much to ask. Roman Volkov's nightclub was buried deep in the heart of Brighton Beach, the Russian quarter of Brooklyn, the kind of neighborhood where even the police hesitated to set foot after dark. Dante arrived at 10 o'clock that night, alone, with only Luca waiting in the car 2 blocks away. He wore a black 3-piece suit, carried no visible weapon, and walked into the club with the bearing of a man who owned the place rather than someone venturing into enemy territory. Inside, Russian music pounded against his eardrums. Red lights pulsed like the veins of some enormous beast, and the smell of vodka and expensive cigarette smoke thickened the air until it was hard to breathe. Girls in short dresses moved between tables, serving cold-faced men whose tattoos showed beneath the cuffs of expensive shirts. When Dante stepped through the door, every gaze swung toward him, and the atmosphere in the room seemed to congeal, as if someone had sucked the oxygen out of the air. A huge man with a neck like a bull stepped in his way. Nikolai, Volkov's most trusted enforcer, the one who handled the kind of debt collection jobs that made even hardened criminals shudder. He was half a head taller than Dante, with shoulders as broad as a doorway and a scar that ran from the corner of his eye to his jaw, as if someone had once tried to split his face open with a knife. "Moretti," he growled, his heavy Russian accent grinding like stone. "You have the nerve to walk in here alone?" "I am here to see Volkov," Dante replied, his voice utterly steady. "Tell him I brought money." Nikolai stared at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether to shoot him where he stood or wait for orders. Then he turned away and disappeared through the velvet curtain of the VIP door at the back of the club. A few minutes later, he returned and jerked his chin toward the door. "He will see you." Volkov's VIP room was decorated in the style of the old Tsars, all red velvet and gold leaf and stone-faced angels that looked as if they were about to weep. Roman Volkov sat in the center, on a chair that might as well have been a throne, a glass of vodka in one hand and a half-smoked Cuban cigar resting in the ashtray. He was 54 years old, his white hair cropped short in a military cut, his eyes the color of stainless steel, so cold that anyone who looked into them saw nothing but death. But it was not his eyes that made him terrifying. It was the long scar that ran from his left temple to his chin, a jagged curve like someone had tried to carve his face open with a broken bottle, and he had stayed alive just to take revenge. 6 gunmen ringed the room, all of them watching Dante like he was a piece of meat about to be carved. "Dante Moretti," Volkov said, his Russian voice low and slow, like a bear rumbling in its den. "The Manhattan wolf rarely leaves his lair. What makes you so reckless tonight?" Dante did not take the empty chair across from him. He remained standing, set a black leather briefcase on the table between them, and opened it. Inside were neat stacks of cash, totaling $192,000 to the exact cent. "The debt of Ilara Bennett," he said, his voice iced over. "Principal and interest. Every last dollar, as calculated by my people." Volkov raised his brows, his gaze sliding from the money to Dante and back again. Surprise flickered for an instant across his scarred face, but he smothered it quickly beneath a cold smile. "The little maid," he said. "You come all this way to pay off a maid?" "I have come to buy someone," Dante answered without blinking. "From this moment on, Ilara Bennett is under the protection of the Moretti family. If any of your men touch her, even a single strand of hair, even with a look, even with a word of threat, I will consider it an act of war." The air in the room turned heavy as concrete. Nikolai stepped forward, hand drifting toward the gun at his back, but Volkov lifted a hand and stilled him. He studied Dante, those steel-colored eyes searching his opponent's unreadable face. Then he laughed, a dry sound like bone snapping. "You are stirring up a hornet's nest for a nobody, Moretti." He leaned forward, the tip of his cigar glowing red between thick, scarred fingers. "What do you even know about that girl? She is cursed. Her father, a gambling addict, died like a dog in the street. Her mother abandoned her like a disease. Her boyfriend tricked her into jail. Even the baby in her belly did not live. Everyone who gets near her ends up ruined. And you want to bring that bad luck into your own house?" Dante did not move. His face stayed as cold as stone. "I don't believe in fate," he said, his tone smooth and flat. "I believe in strength." Volkov was silent for a moment. Then he reached for the briefcase, flipped through a few stacks of cash as if checking the quality of a shipment. At last, he snapped the case shut and nodded. "Fine. The money is right. The girl is clear. She owes nothing." He looked up, and in those gray eyes Dante saw not acceptance, but a promise of something far darker. "But remember this, Moretti. You just bought yourself a piece of trouble no one else wanted. And in our world, trouble like that is always paid for in blood." Dante picked up the now empty case, fastened his jacket, and turned to leave without a word of farewell. He did not have to look back to know Volkov was watching him with the eyes of a man already planning his next move. And he was right. The moment the door shut behind Dante, Volkov crooked a finger at Nikolai. "Follow the girl," he murmured, his voice sharp as a blade. "If Moretti cares that much about her, she may be useful. Find out where she lives, what she does, who she sees, and wait for my word." Nikolai nodded, a cruel smile spreading across his lips. The Manhattan Wolf had just exposed his weakness. And Volkov was not the kind of man who ever let an opportunity like that pass. 2 weeks passed after the night Dante faced Volkov in Brighton Beach. 2 weeks in which Alara's life changed in ways she had never imagined. She no longer lived in the shabby studio in Queens, the one with walls so damp she slept with the blanket over her face to avoid breathing in mold spores, the place where neighbors fought at 3 a.m. and police sirens were her nightly lullaby. Dante had arranged for her to move into a 1-bedroom apartment in Hell's Kitchen, on the 12th floor of a building with 24-hour security, cameras at every corner, and windows that looked out over the Hudson River. For the first time in her life, Alara woke to sunlight filtering through white curtains instead of someone screaming in the hallway. She had refused to live in the penthouse when Dante suggested it. "I need my own space," she had said, and he had not argued. He had simply nodded, told Luca to install a security system in the new apartment, and never brought it up again. Her new job began on the 3rd day after she moved. She was given a small office in the headquarters of Moretti Enterprises in Midtown, not in the penthouse. The office contained a desk, a laptop, and stacks of files piled high enough to reach her chest. Her task was simple, at least in theory. Analyze logistics data, look for anomalies, report directly to Dante. No one explained what logistics meant in this context, but Alara was not naive. She knew the Moretti family did not survive on real estate and restaurants alone. She knew the numbers glowing on the screen likely stood for things she would be better off not knowing too clearly. But she also knew she no longer had other options. And compared to being slowly strangled by Volkov, working for Dante Moretti in an air-conditioned office on a soft chair was paradise. On the first day, she simply sat and stared at the stack of files and felt overwhelmed. On the second day, she began to read, to take notes, to try to understand the structure of the data. On the third day, she found it. A discrepancy of 3% in the transportation logistics column that Dante had mentioned the first night he caught her in the kitchen. Alara did not know it was the problem he had been tracking. She did not try to understand the math. The math was overwhelming. Instead, she stopped reading the numbers as currency and started looking at them as lines on a canvas. She remembered her days preparing for Parsons, learning about perspective and vanishing points. She spread the sheets out on the floor, stepping back to see the shape of the data. The legitimate shipments flowed like a smooth, continuous brushstroke, predictable, rhythmic. But the southern route, it was jagged. The numbers stuttered. There was a negative space where there should have been density. It wasn't just a math error. It was a flaw in the composition, a forced stroke trying to hide a mistake. She traced the jagged line back, layer by layer, until the pattern revealed itself. Carmine DeLuca, a mid-level capo in charge of the southern route, was skimming 3% from every shipment and funneling it into a personal account through a shell company in Delaware. She wrote a report, attached the evidence, and sent an email to Dante at 11 at night. The next morning, Dante appeared in her doorway. He did not knock. He only stood there with a cup of coffee in his hand, looking at her with an expression she could not read. "My team spent 2 weeks and found nothing," he said, his voice even. "You did it in 3 days. Alara rubbed her tired eyes, looking at the spreadsheet that was now covered in red marker circles. "Your accountants look for mistakes in the math," she said softly. "But the math was perfect. Whoever stole from you is good at calculation." She pointed to the screen. "I didn't look for a mistake. I looked for a lie. When you draw a portrait, if one eye is slightly wrong, it ruins the whole face. Even if the measurements are right, the expression is fake. This account." She tapped the southern route column. "It has no soul. It's too perfect, too rhythmic, it's artificial." Dante did not say anything else. He simply nodded and walked away, leaving Alara with a heart beating faster than usual, and a strange feeling that perhaps she was not as useless as she had always believed. The days that followed slipped into a steady rhythm. Alara arrived at the office at 8 a.m, worked until 8 at night, then went back to her new apartment. She and Dante rarely spoke face to face. Almost everything went through email or through Luca, professional, distant, as if the night she had told him her entire life in that kitchen had never happened. But there was one thing Alara noticed, a small detail she did not quite know how to interpret. Whenever she worked late, whenever she forgot lunch or skipped dinner because she was too absorbed in the data, there was always something waiting on her desk the next morning. A sandwich wrapped in parchment paper, a box of salad with a plastic fork, a bottle of fresh orange juice. No note, no explanation. The food was simply there, as if it had appeared out of thin air. The first time, Alara thought it must be a mistake. The second time, she began to wonder. The third time, She saw Dante leaving her office on the hallway camera feed while she was in the bathroom, and she understood. She did not say anything. She did not thank him. She only ate everything he left, one bite at a time, and tried not to think about why a mafia boss would care whether she was eating properly. The food always disappeared, and every morning, something new appeared. They never spoke of it. They did not need to. But in that silence, something was shifting. Something neither of them was ready to name. It was a normal afternoon, as ordinary as any other, or at least that was what Alara thought. She was sitting in her office, eyes fixed on her laptop, analyzing a string of suspicious transactions from the Eastern Route, when Dante walked in without warning. He had that habit, appearing like a ghost without making a sound, and every time it happened, Alara startled, no matter how hard she tried to hide it. Today he carried a fresh stack of files, which he set on her desk with a flat thud. "Reports from the Chicago branch," he said, his tone as short as always. "I need you to go through them before Friday." Alara nodded and reached for the stack. That was when it happened. The sleeve of her shirt, the white shirt she wore almost every day because it was one of the 2 decent shirts she owned, slipped up as she stretched out her arm. Only a few centimeters. Only a fleeting moment, but it was enough to expose the scar. It lay on the inside of her left wrist, a faint, pale pink line about 3 centimeters long, running across the thin blue veins beneath her bloodless skin. The scar was old, faded, but still clear enough that anyone who saw it would understand what it meant, and Dante had seen it. Alara knew that at once from the way he went very still, from the way his gray eyes lingered on her wrist a heartbeat longer than they should, from the way his jaw tightened as if he had just swallowed something bitter. She snatched her hand back, yanked her sleeve down so quickly she almost dropped the files, and lowered her head so she would not have to meet his gaze. Her heart hammered wildly in her chest, blood rushing to her face and then draining away, leaving a cold sensation as if someone had poured ice water down her spine. Dante did not ask. He did not say a single word about what he had just seen. He only stood there for a few more suffocating seconds, then turned and walked out of the office. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but to Alara, it sounded like thunder on a clear day. She sat there alone, her hands gripping the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned white, and forced herself to breathe. In, out, in, out. Don't think about it. Don't remember. But memory does not care what we want. It rose up like a tide and dragged her back to that night, the night she had believed would be her last. It had been a year earlier, a few months after her father died and Volkov began to tighten the noose. Alara had worked 18 hours straight, feet swollen from standing too long, back aching from bending over to scrub and carry, mind emptied out by exhaustion. She reached her shabby studio at 2 a.m, opened the refrigerator, and found it empty. She opened her wallet and saw 3 coins. She looked into the mirror and saw a skeleton wrapped in skin, eyes sunken, hair falling out in clumps from malnutrition. She had paid Volkov $500 that week, and the debt had still risen instead of falling. She would never escape. Never. She would die inside this spiral, die still owing money, die with no one knowing, no one caring, no one remembering. She had picked up the knife, the small fruit knife with its bright blade shining under the flickering fluorescent light. She had pressed it against her wrist, feeling the cold of the metal on her skin. She had thought that one cut would be enough, just one, and everything would be over. No more pain, no more exhaustion, no more Volkov, no more debt, no more anything. She had drawn the blade, not deep, not enough to die, just enough for the blood to flow, dark red on her pale skin, and she had watched it as if she were watching a film about someone else. Then she heard the knock. "Alara, dear?" The voice of Mrs. Edith Callahan came through the thin door. "I saw your light was still on. Do you want some soup? I made too much." Alara had stood there, knife in hand, blood dripping onto the floor, and stared at the door. Mrs. Callahan, the 76-year-old woman who lived alone in the apartment next door, forgotten by her grown children, the woman for whom Alara cooked porridge every evening even when she herself had nothing to eat. If she died, who would look after her? Who would remind her to take her diabetes pills? Who would call an ambulance if she fell? Alara had put the knife down. She had wrapped the wound with paper towels and tape. She had opened the door, taken the bowl of soup from Mrs. Callahan's hands, and said she was fine, that she was just staying up late to work. She had survived that night, not because she wanted to live, but because someone needed her. Now, sitting in this luxurious office with a steady job and a safe apartment and her debt wiped clean, Alara still felt the scar on her wrist burning as if it had just been carved. Dante had seen it. He knew. He had not said a word, but he knew. And that made her feel exposed in a way that even telling him her entire life story in that kitchen had not. She did not know that upstairs, in his own office, Dante was standing at the window with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He was thinking about that scar, about what it meant, about the truth he had not seen even after reading every page of her file. She was not just poor. She was not just used, betrayed, abandoned. She had once wanted to die. She had stood at the edge of the cliff and decided to step off. And then, for some reason, she had stopped. She had chosen to live when life had given her no reason to. And that, Dante realized, was not weakness. It was strength. A strength he had never seen in anyone. He had looked at her as prey, as a tool, as a way to provoke Volkov. But from this moment on, he saw her differently. She was not prey. She was a survivor. And in Dante's world, where life and death were separated by a single bullet, the ones who survived were the ones most worthy of respect. 6 weeks passed after the day Dante saw the scar on Alara's wrist, and neither of them mentioned it. They kept working as if nothing had happened, exchanging emails, meeting in short briefings with Luca present, maintaining a professional distance that both of them seemed determined to preserve. But something had changed. Alara felt it in the way Dante looked at her, no longer with the cold, measuring gaze of a boss inspecting an employee, but with something deeper, something that unsettled her because she had no name for it. He no longer left food on her desk. Instead, somehow, the refrigerator in the staff lounge always contained the things she liked, the things she used to eat when she was a maid, the things only someone who had watched closely would know. She did not ask. She did not want to know the answer. That night, rain came down over Manhattan in sheets. Not the soft, romantic drizzle of the movies, but a hard, relentless downpour, as if the sky were trying to drown the city. Alara worked later than usual, buried in a tangle of complex transactions from the Miami branch until she forgot about time altogether. When she finally glanced up at the clock, it was already close to 11 at night. She ran to the nearest bus stop, but the last bus had left 10 minutes earlier. She stood under the small metal awning, staring at the curtain of white rain in front of her, and weighed her options. A taxi was not one of them. Even now, when she had a steady salary, the habit of saving until it hurt was carved deep into her bones after so many years of going without. $20 for a cab ride back to Hell's Kitchen was $20 she could use for something else. She would walk. She had walked in far worse conditions. Alara stepped out from under the shelter and was swallowed by the rain at once. Cold water soaked through her shirt in seconds, gluing the fabric to her skin and making her shiver. Her hair fell loose around her face, water streaming down her cheeks, but she lowered her head and kept moving. She had survived worse things than a storm. She had gone about 2 blocks when a sleek black car pulled up beside her, its tires sending up a wave that splashed across the sidewalk. The back door opened, and a familiar voice sounded from inside, cold and leaving no room for argument. "Get in." Alara froze, rain running into her eyes, and looked into the darkness of the car where Dante was sitting. He wore a black 3-piece suit, looking as if he had just come from a meeting or from doing something she did not want to know about, and his gray eyes rested on her with something that looked very much like anger. "I don't need," she began, but Dante cut her off at once. "That was not a question. Get in. Now." There was something in his voice, a faint tremor she had never heard before, that kept her from arguing. She climbed into the car and sank into the cream leather seat, guilt flaring as water dripped from her clothes into the expensive upholstery. The door shut, and suddenly the space around her felt small and airless. The scent of Dante's cologne mixed with the smell of rain on her skin, the leather of the seats, a trace of whiskey from the glass in his hand. The car rolled forward, and Alara sat there soaked and shivering, trying to occupy as little space as possible. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the drumming of rain on the roof and the steady rhythm of the wipers. Then Dante spoke, his voice low and strange in the darkness. "You confuse me, Alara." She turned her head, unsure she had heard him correctly. He was not looking at her. His eyes were on the window, following the streams of water racing down the glass. "What is confusing?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the cold. "I am just someone repaying a debt. I work for you to pay back what you spent." Dante looked at her then, and in the flicker of passing streetlights, she saw something in his eyes she could not name. "No," he said, more softly than she had ever heard him speak. "You are not just someone repaying a debt. I read your file. I know what you have been through. Your mother leaving, your father destroying your life, being tricked, being arrested, losing your child, losing everything." Alara went rigid. not knowing how to react as he recited the tragedies of her life like items on a shopping list. But Dante was not finished. Almost anyone else who went through what you did would be bitter, he went on. They would hate the world. They would use any chance they had to strike back at life. He leaned toward her, and Alara suddenly realized how close they were, close enough for her to see each black eyelash framing his eyes. But you did not, he said. You still cooked porridge for that old woman next door when you had nothing for yourself. You still cleaned every room as if your life depended on it. You are still gentle after everything. That does not make sense. Alara wanted to say something, to explain that she was not gentle, that she was just trying to survive each day, that she had never had any other choice. But the words got stuck in her throat when Dante suddenly shrugged off the cashmere coat he was wearing and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric still held the warmth of his body, wrapping around her like an invisible embrace. His scent, sandalwood and whiskey and something that was simply him, closed in around her senses. She looked up, her lips parting to protest or to thank him. She did not even know which, but he had already turned away, staring out the window again as if nothing had happened. You are shaking, he said, his voice back to its usual coolness. I don't want my employees coming down with pneumonia. The car stopped in front of her building in Hell's Kitchen. Alara stepped out, still wrapped in his coat, and turned back to give it to him. But the door had already shut, and the black sedan slid away into the rain, leaving her standing there with her heart pounding out of rhythm and a coat worth more than a month of her old salary. He did not ask for it back. And that night, for the first time in years, Alara fell asleep holding that coat close, breathing in the scent of a man she knew she should not be thinking about in the way she was starting to. 1 week after that rainy night, Dante still did not ask for the coat. Alara had washed it, pressed it carefully, and folded it neatly into a paper bag to bring back to the office. But each time she tried to do it, something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he never mentioned it, as if that expensive coat meant nothing at all. Maybe it was the lingering memory of its warmth on her shoulders, of his scent in every thread. She told herself she was being foolish, that it was nothing more than a boss making sure an employee did not get sick. Nothing more, nothing less. But her heart refused to listen to reason. That afternoon, Dante called her while she was on her way home. His voice was as brief as ever. There are urgent documents I need you to review before tomorrow. I will have someone bring them to your apartment within 1 hour. Alara agreed without a second thought, not knowing that the person bringing the documents would not be Luca or anyone from Dante's team. Exactly 1 hour later, the doorbell rang while she was in Mrs. Callahan's kitchen, stirring a pot of oatmeal bubbling on the stove. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, ran over to her own apartment, opened the door, and froze when she saw Dante standing in the hallway. He wore a charcoal gray suit, a thick envelope of documents in one hand, and he was looking at her with an expression that could only be called puzzled. It took Alara a few seconds to register how she must look. She was wearing an old apron printed with faded sunflowers, her hands still dusted with oat flour, her hair twisted into a messy knot on top of her head with stray strands falling everywhere. She looked like a housewife who had stepped out of the 1950s, not an analyst working for a Mafia boss. Mr. Moretti, she blurted, her voice so startled it was almost a shout. I did not know you would come in person. Dante raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking over the apron and her flower-streaked hands. I was on my way home. It was convenient, he said, though they both knew an apartment in Hell's Kitchen was nowhere near a convenient stop on the route from a midtown office to a penthouse near Central Park West. You are cooking? It was a foolish question, but he asked it because he was genuinely curious. In all the time he had known her, he had never seen Alara truly eat a proper meal, let alone cook. She had been the woman who shoveled food into her mouth as if someone might snatch it away, the woman who stole leftovers in the night because she could not afford dinner. Not for me, Alara answered quickly. Then, as if suddenly remembering something, her eyes widened and she spun around. The porridge. She rushed back toward the neighboring apartment, whose door was still ajar, and Dante stood in the hallway for a moment before curiosity finally overrode discipline, and he followed. Mrs. Callahan's apartment was smaller than Alara's, but it had the coziness that comes from an old person living alone for far too long. Family photos covered the walls, but the dust on their frames said they were relics of the past rather than part of the present. The air held the mix of medicine and warm oatmeal. In the center of the tiny living room, on a worn sofa, an old woman with white hair sat with a blanket over her knees, her eyes clouded by age yet lighting up when she saw Alara. Alara, dear, is the porridge ready? She asked, her voice hoarse but warm. I am so hungry. Alara went straight to the kitchen, turned off the stove, and began ladling porridge into a bowl. "It is ready, Grandma," she said, her voice soft in a way Dante had never heard from her. "I added a little honey today, but only a little because of your blood sugar." Then she looked up and saw Dante standing in the doorway, and a flicker of embarrassment crossed her face. "This is Mrs. Callahan," she explained, though he had not asked. "She lives next door. I usually cook porridge for her in the evenings." Mrs. Callahan leaned forward, trying to see past Alara to the stranger. Her cloudy eyes blinked, and a toothless smile slowly spread across her wrinkled face. "Oh, we have a visitor?" she said, excited as a child. "It is rare anyone comes to see Alara. The girl is too lonely. I worry about her all the time. Are you her friend?" Dante had no idea how to answer. What was he to Alara? Her employer, her rescuer, the man who had bought her freedom with cash. Before he could find words, Alara spoke for him. "He is a colleague, Mrs. Edith," she said quickly. "He came to bring some documents." Mrs. Callahan nodded, but her gaze lingered on Dante longer than necessary, as if she were quietly weighing him. "A handsome colleague?" she said, and Alara flushed while Dante felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Then the old woman turned back to Alara, taking her hand as the younger woman brought the bowl of porridge over. "My girl is a good one," she told Dante, her voice full of pride, as if she were speaking of her own child. "She comes every night to cook for me, reminds me to take my medicine. My children are in California. They call once a year, and every time they ask if I am dead yet so they can split whatever I have left. Only Alara is here. Only this girl." Dante stood there, watching Alara sit down beside the old woman, patiently feeding her spoon after spoon of porridge, gently wiping the corners of her wrinkled mouth when a bit spilled. She looked different from the woman in his office, different from the trembling girl stealing leftovers in his kitchen. She looked at peace, and Dante realized something that made his chest tighten. Alara had nothing. She had lost everything, from her family to her dreams to even her reason for living. Yet she still gave. She still cooked porridge for the old neighbor even when she herself had been hungry. She still cared for a stranger like family even though her own family had left her behind. In Dante's world, where everything had a price, where kindness was usually just a mask for some hidden purpose, Alara's uncalculated generosity was something he could not comprehend, and it was also the thing that made it impossible for him to look away from her. He left not long after, dropping the envelope of documents on the table with a brief farewell. But on the drive back to the penthouse, in the black car gliding through Manhattan's glowing streets, Dante did not think about work or enemies or the empire he ruled. He thought about those small hands lifting each spoonful of porridge, about that tender voice saying, "My girl," and about the way his own heart, the heart he had believed dead for a very long time, was beating to a rhythm he no longer controlled. 2 months passed after the night Dante stood in Mrs. Callahan's tiny apartment and watched Alara feed the old woman with a gentleness he had not known still existed in the world. 2 months in which everything between them both changed and did not change. They still worked together. They still kept things professional. They still called each other Mr. Moretti and Miss Bennett in meetings. But there were moments, glances that lasted a little longer than they should, fingers brushing when they passed files back and forth, and neither of them pulling away immediately. Nights when Alara worked late in the penthouse and Dante found reasons to stay in his office instead of going to his bedroom. Neither of them admitted anything, yet the space between them had grown so thick with unspoken things it felt as if it could be cut with a knife. That night, Alara was buried in a string of suspicious transactions when she found it, proof of an internal scheme larger than anything she had uncovered before. This was not just some mid-level capo skimming a few percent. This was something bigger, something tied to someone in a higher position, something that could threaten Dante's entire empire. She gathered all the documents into a folder, checked them 3 times to be sure she had not made a mistake, then ran up to the penthouse office near 11 at night. She did not call ahead. She did not pause to think. All she knew was that Dante needed to see this immediately. When she pushed open his office door, she stopped short. Dante was standing with his back to her, one hand braced against the glass window that looked out over Manhattan drowning in darkness, the other gripping his phone so tightly she could see his knuckles from where she stood. He had just ended a call, and his entire body was drawn tight like a string about to snap. "Mr. Moretti?" Alara said softly, careful, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found something you should see." Dante did not turn around. He stood there for a few more seconds, his shoulders lifting and falling with heavy breaths. Then he hurled the phone onto the desk with a thud loud enough to make her flinch. When he did turn, she saw that his face was as cold as ice, but his gray eyes burned with something that looked like betrayal and fury and pain woven together. Marco Benedetti, he said, grinding the name out between his teeth. Capo in charge of the northern route. A man I have treated like a brother for 15 years. He has been selling information to Volkov. Alara stood very still, not knowing what to say. She knew Marco. She had seen him at meetings, a middle-aged man with an easy smile and a booming laugh. She had never imagined he would be the traitor. And from the look on Dante's face, neither had he. A heavy silence settled over the room. Alara wanted to offer some kind of comfort, but she knew there were no words that could touch this. In Dante's world, betrayal was not just a wound. It was a death sentence for the one who betrayed and a permanent scar for the one betrayed. She set the folder on his desk as gently as if she were afraid any sudden sound might shatter him. "This is what I found," she said quietly. "There are others. It is not only Marco." Dante did not look down at the folder. He looked at her, and there was something in his gaze that kept her rooted to the spot even though every instinct in her legs told her to run. Then he spoke, his voice suddenly softer in a way that stripped away her defenses. "Why are you still here, Alara?" She blinked, not understanding the question. "I brought you the documents." "No." He cut her off and stepped toward her. "Why are you still here? Your debt was paid the first day. You could walk away at any time. You could find another job, live a normal life, stay away from my world. Why are you still here?" Alara wanted to say that she stayed because of the 3-year agreement, that she stayed because of the good salary and the safe apartment and the stability, but those reasons, true as they were not the truth, and she was too tired to lie, too tired to pretend she did not feel what she felt every time she was near him. "For the first time in my life, I feel seen," she said, her voice so soft it was almost air. "Not as a burden, not as a victim, not as prey or a tool or anything someone else wants me to be." She lifted her head and met his eyes, not looking away. "You see me, really see me, and I don't know what to do with that." Dante stood only a step away from her, close enough that she could smell whiskey on his breath, sandalwood on his skin. He raised his hand, slowly, as if he were afraid of startling her, and laid his palm against her cheek. His hand was warm and rough, and Alara felt a jolt of something travel through her at the point where their skin met. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, those gray eyes searching her face for something, and she understood he was giving her a choice. A chance to move away, a chance to say no, a chance to keep everything safe inside the familiar lines of professionalism and distance. But Alara had lost too many things in her life to be afraid of losing more. She had stood at the edge of death and decided to live. She had looked into the abyss and refused to step off. If she could do that, she could do this. She did not pull away. She stayed where she was, her breath turning shallow, her heart pounding against her ribs, and let him see the answer in her eyes. Dante drew a long breath, as if steadying himself, then lowered his head and pressed his mouth to hers. The kiss was not rushed, not demanding, not the searing thing she had read about in books or watched in films. It was slow, gentle, as if Dante were trying to say something he could not find words for. His lips were warm and soft, and when he drew her closer, one hand sliding around her waist while the other stayed on her cheek, Alara felt something inside her chest dissolve, something that had been frozen for a very long time, since the day her mother walked out, since the night she miscarried alone, since the moment she had stared at a knife and thought about ending everything. She laid her palm against his chest, feeling the wild stutter of his heartbeat under his shirt, and realized that he was shaking too. Dante Moretti, the feared Mafia boss, the man who made all of New York nervous, was trembling as he kissed her. And that, more than any words he could have spoken, made Alara believe that maybe, just maybe, she was no longer alone. 3 months had passed since the night Dante paid off all of Alara's debt and made his offer in the penthouse kitchen. 3 months in which her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. She was no longer the maid, stealing leftovers in the dark. She was a special analysis assistant, the woman who had kissed the most powerful Mafia boss in Manhattan in his office, someone she barely recognized when she looked in the mirror each morning. After that kiss, they did not talk about it. There were no promises, no declarations, nothing officially altered, but everything was different. The way Dante looked at her when she walked into a room, the way his hand brushed her back when they passed each other in the hallway, the way he said her name, Alara, instead of Miss Bennett, when they were alone. They were suspended in the gray space between boss and employee, between protector and protected, between something else neither of them dared to name. That morning, Luca came to Alara's office with a face more serious than usual. He said nothing, simply laid an envelope on her desk and told her the boss wanted to see her immediately. Alara followed Luca up to the penthouse, her stomach tight with unease. and when she stepped into Dante's office, she saw him standing behind his desk, with a spread of photographs laid out in front of him. His gray eyes darkened when he looked at her, and Alara knew something was very wrong. Dante did not waste time. He pointed at the photos and spoke in a voice hard as steel. "Volkov is watching you." Alara moved closer, looked down at the images, and felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. There was a picture of her leaving the building in Hell's Kitchen, a picture of her walking to the bus stop, a picture of her buying coffee at the corner shop, and in the corner of each image, the same familiar black sport utility vehicle, with a shape seated inside. She recognized the man at once. Nikolai, Volkov's most trusted enforcer, the man who had come to her home when she was 13 and told her she could help pay off her father's debt in another way. "They have been watching you for at least 2 weeks, Dante said, his voice holding back a fury Alara could feel boiling just beneath the surface. "Maybe longer. My people only picked it up this morning." Alara stood there, staring at the photographs, and felt the wall of safety she had been building for 3 months begin to crumble. She had believed she was free of Volkov. She had believed that once the debt was paid, she was done. But clearly, in this world, no one was ever truly free. "You need to move in here," Dante said, and it was not a suggestion. "The penthouse has security 24 hours a day. No one gets in without my authorization. You will be safe here." Alara lifted her head, met his eyes, and shook her head. "No, I am not a hostage, Dante. I am not going to live in a gilded cage just because some Russian bastard wants to hurt you. This is not a gilded cage." His voice hardened. "This is protection. Volkov will use you to strike at me. He knows you matter to me." Alara blinked at the word matter, but she did not let it distract her. "I have survived 28 years without anyone protecting me," she said, her chin tilting up. "I am not going to start now." Dante stepped forward and gripped her shoulders, and for the first time, Alara saw something that looked like fear in his usually unreadable gray eyes. "You don't understand," he said, his voice dropping low. "Nikolai is not just watching you. He is waiting for orders, and when those orders come, he will not care whether you agree or not. He will drag you into that car and you will be gone before anyone has time to pick up a phone and call the police. And what happens after that?" Dante did not finish the sentence, but Alara understood. She had heard enough stories about Volkov to know what waited for those who fell into his hands. She looked back down at the photos, at Nikolai's face behind the windshield, and at last, she nodded. "All right," she whispered. "But Mrs. Callahan, she will have no one. I cannot just leave her." Dante said nothing. He only looked at her with an expression she could not quite decipher, then nodded once at Luca, who was still standing at the door. Alara did not understand the silent exchange between them, and she did not ask. She was too tired, too frightened, too overwhelmed by the realization that the nightmare named Volkov had never truly ended. 3 days later, after Alara had moved into the guest room of the penthouse and was still trying to adjust to this new life, Luca came to her with a piece of paper. She took it, glanced down, and for a moment her brain refused to process the words. It was a payment receipt from an upscale nursing home on the Upper East Side. The name of the resident was Edith Callahan, and the amount paid for the next 5 years was a figure so large Alara did not dare speak it aloud. She stood there holding the paper with trembling hands, then looked up at Dante, who was standing by the window as if nothing had happened. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice tight. Dante did not turn around. "She needs medical care that her old apartment cannot provide," he said, his tone as calm as if they were discussing the weather. "This home has nurses who specialize in diabetes, and a full program of social activities for seniors. She will not be lonely there." Alara wanted to say something, to ask why, to tell him he did not have to do this, that Mrs. Callahan was not his responsibility, that she herself did not deserve this kind of kindness. But instead of words, what came out were tears. For the first time in many years, Alara cried, not loud, heaving sobs, but silent tears that slid down her cheeks and fell onto the paper in her hand, blurring the numbers and the signature. She cried because Mrs. Callahan would be cared for. She cried because someone had done this for her without asking for anything in return. She cried because for the first time in her life, she felt that someone had truly seen her. Not just her pain, but the things she loved. Dante turned when he heard her soft, broken sound, and he froze. He had seen Alara in many states, afraid, exhausted, angry, defiant, but he had never seen her cry. She was the woman who had miscarried alone and not shed a single tear, the woman who had told him the entire tragedy of her life in a flat, emotionless voice. the woman who had looked at a knife and chosen to live without anyone there to hold her. Yet now, because an old neighbor had been moved to a nursing home, she was crying as if her heart had just been freed from the armor she had worn for 28 years. Dante crossed the room, said nothing, and pulled her into his arms, letting her cry against his chest. And in that moment, he understood that he would do anything to make sure he never saw her in that kind of pain again. Anything. Dante's penthouse was no longer what it had been. The apartment that had once been a fortress of solitude, where silence was the only language and darkness his closest companion, had changed in ways even he did not notice until he stopped and looked around. There was a small pair of pale pink slippers by the front door, the ones Ilara wore in the house because she hated walking barefoot on the cold stone floor. There was a mug with sunflowers on the kitchen shelf, the one she used for tea every morning because she did not like coffee. There was a faint lavender scent drifting from the bathroom, the smell of her shampoo, a scent Dante could no longer encounter anywhere else without thinking of her. Small changes, almost insignificant, yet they had turned his cold fortress into something that resembled a real home. Mornings became something Dante found himself looking forward to. Before, he had woken at 5, worked out alone, drank black coffee alone, and read reports alone before starting his day. He had never bothered with breakfast because he saw no point in sitting alone in front of a plate of food. Now, each morning he woke to the sound of Ilara moving around in the kitchen, to the smell of eggs and toast drifting through the apartment, to her soft singing of songs he did not know but whose melodies were already etched into his mind. She cooked breakfast for them both, not because she had to, but because, she said, she had become so used to cooking for Mrs. Callahan that she did not know what else to do with herself in the mornings. Dante did not argue. He sat at the kitchen island, watched her move through the space that had once belonged only to Chef Marcello, and felt something warm spread through his chest that he did not know how to name. They began to talk in those mornings, not about business or Volkov or the threats lurking outside, but about the things that truly mattered, the things they had each locked away in the darkest rooms of their minds and never allowed anyone else to see. Dante told her about his father, Giovanni Moretti, the man who had built this empire from nothing but his own 2 hands and the blood of his enemies. He was not a good father, Dante said one morning, his voice low and far away. He was a teacher. He taught me how to kill before he taught me how to love. And when he died, I realized he had never taught me the second part at all. Ilara listened, without judgment, without pity. She simply laid her hand over his, as if that alone were enough to say that she understood. And perhaps it was. In return, Ilara told him things she had never said to anyone. About the night she lost the baby in the bar bathroom, about sitting there alone while the bass from the music shook the walls, watching the blood flow and feeling as if the universe were punishing her for daring to hope, about the scar on her wrist, about the fruit knife and the flickering light, about how she had decided to die and then decided to live because of a knock on the door from an old woman next door. She spoke in a trembling voice, tears running down her face, and Dante drew her into his arms, holding her as if he could shield her from the memories tearing her apart from the inside. He did not offer empty phrases like, "Everything will be all right," or "You are so strong." He simply held her and let her cry, because sometimes that was all a person needed. That night came as naturally as breathing. No plan, no calculation, nothing but 2 people who were too tired to keep pretending they did not need each other. Dante had just received word that a shipment had been seized by federal agents, costing him millions and leading to the arrest of 2 of his men. He sat in his office with his 3rd glass of whiskey, staring out at the Manhattan night and feeling so empty it was as if someone had hollowed him out. Ilara found him there, and instead of asking what had happened, she simply sat down beside him, laid her head on his shoulder, and stayed. They sat like that for a long time, in silence, until Dante turned his head to look at her, and she turned hers to look at him, and the space between them suddenly became unbearable. They did not reach for each other only because of desire, though there was that too. They reached for each other because they needed comfort, because they needed to know that in this world of blood and betrayal, there was still someone who would stay when everything fell apart. Dante led her into his bedroom, the room no one had ever entered but him, and he loved her with a gentleness he had not known he still possessed. She loved him too, with her thin body and broken heart, with kisses salty from tears and whispers in the dark. They did not talk much. They did not have to. The language of their bodies was enough to carry what words could never quite hold. The next morning, Ilara woke in Dante's arms, sunlight slipping through the curtains to draw golden lines across her skin. She tried to move, but his arm tightened, keeping her there. "You are not my employee anymore," Dante said, his voice low and rough with sleep, but steady. "You are mine." Ilara turned to face him, and instead of agreeing like the heroine in a romance novel, she lifted a brow and answered in her familiar, stubborn tone. I don't belong to anyone, Dante. I am not an object for you to own. He studied her for a long moment, and then a small, rare smile touched the corner of his mouth. Then I belong to you, he murmured. I am yours. Is that acceptable? Ilara did not answer with words. She bent and kissed him, and in that kiss was everything she did not know how to say. That she had lost too much to trust happiness. That she was still afraid it would all vanish like every good thing in her life had vanished before, but that she was willing to try. For him, for them, because for the first time in 28 years, she had something worth risking herself for. 2 weeks passed after the night they reached for each other. 2 weeks in which Ilara felt like she was living inside a dream she might wake from at any moment. She still worked. She still analyzed data. She still maintained professional distance from Dante in front of others. But every night she slept in his arms, and every morning she woke to his kiss on her forehead. She knew this could not last forever. She knew Dante's world did not allow happiness to live for long. But she tried not to think about that, tried to savor each moment as if it were the last. That afternoon, Ilara asked Dante for permission to visit Mrs. Callahan at the nursing home. She had not seen the old woman for almost a week because work had been so heavy, and she missed her, missed that rough voice calling her daughter, missed those wrinkled hands gripping hers as if afraid she might disappear. Dante did not want her to go. She could see it in the clench of his jaw when she brought it up, but in the end he nodded, on the condition that 2 bodyguards go with her, and that she not step away from them for even a moment. The visit was ordinary. Mrs. Callahan lit up when she saw her, chattering about her new friends at the home, about the morning yoga class she attended even though she could only sit in her wheelchair and wave her arms to the music. Ilara sat beside her for 2 hours, holding her hand, listening to her stories, and feeling something inside herself slowly knit back together. When she got up to leave, Mrs. Callahan held her hand tighter and spoke in a tone more serious than usual. That young man loves you very much, Ilara, she said. I saw it in his eyes when he came last week to ask me about you. Don't let fear keep you from being happy. My girl. Ilara had not known Dante had visited Mrs. Callahan. She wanted to ask more, but the old woman was tired and she did not want to push. She kissed her forehead, promised to come back the following week, and walked out with a lighter heart than when she had arrived. She did not know that it would be the last time she saw Mrs. Callahan for a long while. It happened with terrifying precision. Dante had insisted on the armored sedan, a fortress on wheels with reinforced steel and bulletproof glass designed to withstand assault rifles. He had accounted for bullets, but he hadn't accounted for physics. As they turned onto a quiet road, a heavy sanitation truck, waiting with its engine idling in an alley, roared out. It didn't just block them, it accelerated, slamming into the side of the sedan with the force of a freight train. Metal screamed. The armored sedan spun wildly across the asphalt, skidding sideways until it slammed into a concrete barrier. The airbags deployed instantly, filling the cabin with white dust and choking silence. The driver, a veteran ex-Marine, was pinned by the crushed dashboard, blood streaming from his temple, unconscious before he could reach his weapon. The second bodyguard in the passenger seat tried to move, fighting the concussion, but the door was jammed shut by the impact. He smashed his fist against the window, shouting something Ilara couldn't hear over the ringing in her ears. Then a shadow loomed over the glass. Not a gun. A gun wouldn't work. Nikolai stood there, holding a heavy tactical sledgehammer. With a brutal, practiced swing, he struck the corner of the reinforced glass once, twice, 3 times, until the spiderweb fractures gave way. Ilara screamed, or at least she thought she did, but the sound was swallowed by revving engines and pounding footsteps. A rough hand seized her by the hair, yanked her out of the car, and she found herself staring into Nikolai's face, that long scar running from the corner of his eye to his chin, his smile cruel as a demon finally catching its prey. He said nothing. He drove his fist into her face, hard enough that stars burst behind her eyes, then shoved a cloth into her mouth and hauled her into the waiting sport utility vehicle. The door slammed, the car roared forward, and Ilara's world sank into darkness. Dante was in a meeting with his capos when his phone buzzed. He meant to ignore it, but the name on the screen made him pause. An unknown number, with a single word attached to the message. Watch. He opened the attached video, and his world came apart. Ilara sat on a metal chair in the middle of a dark room, her hands tied behind her back, her mouth sealed with black tape. Her face was bruised, blood trailing from the corner of her mouth, one eye so swollen it was barely open. But it was not the injuries that stole Dante's breath. It was her eyes, that pale green still burning with defiance even as fear flickered underneath. She was not crying. She was not begging. She was staring straight at the camera, as if she were trying to tell him she was still here, still fighting, that he should not fall apart because of her. Then Volkov's voice came from off-camera, that slow Russian rumble like a snake hissing. "Moretti, you took something from me, I take something from you. Simple as that. Here is what I want. You pull out of 3 areas of Brooklyn, Coney Island, Brighton Beach, and Sheepshead Bay. Sign it over to me. You have 24 hours. If you don't, I will send the girl back to you, piece by piece." The video ended. The screen went black. And Dante Moretti, the man who had built his empire out of blood and steel, who had never hesitated to pull a trigger or lost his composure under any threat, lost control for the first time in his life. He hurled the phone against the wall, the screen shattering into 100 shards. He swept his arm across the conference table, papers and glasses flying. He overturned the table, the crash of wood against stone echoing like thunder, and the capos stepped back in fear, because they had never seen their boss like this. Luca rushed forward, trying to hold him, but Dante shoved him away with the wild strength of a man on the edge. "Find her." His voice was no longer a voice, but the growl of a wounded animal. "Find her now. Search every warehouse, every basement, every rat hole Volkov owns. I don't care how many men, how much money, how many bodies it costs. Find her." He stopped, chest heaving, gray eyes blazing with a fire no one had ever seen. "And if he touches her one more time, I will burn this city to the ground to get to him." The capos glanced at one another, a new terror in their eyes, not fear of Volkov, but fear of the man standing before them, because they realized that Dante Moretti was no longer just the cold, calculating boss they knew. He was a man in love, about to lose the only thing he loved, and there was nothing more dangerous than that. 6 hours passed after Dante received the video, 6 hours in which he did not stay still for a single heartbeat. The conference room in the penthouse now looked like a war map. The table had been set back on its legs, but instead of business reports, it was covered with street grids, satellite images, lists of every property Volkov owned or was rumored to control. 12 capos sat around it, faces drawn tight, none of them daring to speak out of turn. They had seen Dante angry before, seen him coolly order executions without so much as a blink, but they had never seen him like this, had never seen the way his eyes burned as if he truly meant to set the world on fire to find one woman. Luca stood at the end of the table opposite Dante, reporting what his men had found in 6 frantic hours. "We have checked 17 locations," Luca said, his voice tired but focused. "The warehouse in Red Hook, the abandoned cannery in Sunset Park, the basement under the nightclub in Brighton Beach. All empty, or only a few low-level soldiers who know nothing. Volkov is smarter than we thought. He is not keeping her in any place we know." Dante said nothing, his jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his cheek jumped. He stared at the map as if he could burn it through with his gaze and have Alara step out of the ashes. Every minute that passed was another minute she was in Volkov's hands, another minute in which anything could be happening to her. He had seen what Nikolai did to Volkov's debtors, had seen the photographs of bodies tortured until they were no longer recognizable. The thought that Alara might be enduring the same made him want to scream, to smash everything within reach, to kill every man in this room simply because they had not found her fast enough. Then Luca's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time in 6 hours, a spark of hope flickered in his eyes. "Boss," he said, his voice urgent. "We found it. One of the low-level soldiers we grabbed in Brighton Beach finally talked. Volkov has an old warehouse on Staten Island, near the southern docks. On paper it belongs to a shell company, no direct connection to Volkov anywhere in the records. That is why we did not spot it." He set the phone on the table, pulled up a satellite map of the area. "The warehouse is here, about 3 kilometers from the ferry terminal. Our source says there are at least 20 gunmen guarding it, maybe more. 1 main entrance, 2 side entrances, and a basement we believe is where they are keeping her." Dante stared at the map, his mind dropping into the tactical mode his father had drilled into him when he was a boy. He had assaulted places more heavily guarded than this. He had killed enemies more dangerous than Volkov's men, but he had never had this much to lose. 3 in the morning, he said, his voice like steel. "That is when we go in. 3 teams. Teams 1 and 2 lock down the perimeter, block every exit. Team 3 breaches through the east side entrance. The only objective is getting Alara out alive. Anyone in the way is a valid target." He looked around the table, his gaze stopping on each capo in turn. "I will lead Team 3. The room went dead silent. The capos glanced at one another, none of them daring to speak. until Luca stepped forward and braced his hands on the table in front of Dante. "Boss, with all due respect, that is suicide," he said plainly. "Minimum 20 guns, probably more. Terrain we don't know. And Volkov knows you are coming. He is waiting for you. If you lead the breach, you will be the first target they go for." Dante met Luca's eyes, and in his there was no hesitation, no fear, only the absolute certainty of a man who had made his decision and would not be moved. "I did not ask for your opinion, Luca," he said, his voice even but heavy as lead. "I am informing you. I will lead the breach. I will be the first one through that door, and if I have to walk over 20 bodies to get to her, I will do it without blinking." He straightened, planting both hands on the table, and looked each man in the room in the eye. "You may think I am insane. You may think I am risking the entire empire for one woman, and you are right. But this is what you need to understand. If she dies, I will burn this city down. I will kill Volkov, kill Nikolai, kill every bastard who ever laid eyes on her, and after that I will not stop, because if she is gone, I have nothing left to lose." A heavy silence settled over the room. The capos stared at Dante with expressions he could not quite read, something between fear and respect, perhaps both. Then Luca nodded, slowly, and spoke in a low voice. "Then we go with you, boss," he said, "to hell and back if we have to." One by one, the others nodded as well. No one added anything. Dante looked at them, the men who had followed him through fire and blood, and he knew they would not abandon him tonight. He turned and walked to the window, looking out over Manhattan drowned in darkness. In his mind, Alara's face appeared, her pale green eyes staring at him from the phone screen, bruised and swollen and still unbroken. He loved her. He realized it with a suffocating certainty. Not the kind of love in movies, sweet and romantic. The rough, desperate kind. The love of a man willing to die and to kill to protect the only thing that made his life mean anything. "Wait for me, Alara," he whispered into the night. "I am coming." At 3 a.m, the sky over Staten Island was black as ink, without a single star, without a sliver of moon. The warehouse lay motionless in the dark, looking like a sleeping beast, its broken windows blind eyes, its rusted steel door a gaping mouth waiting to swallow whatever came near. Dante sat in the car 300 meters away, eyes fixed on the target through an infrared scope. He counted 14 men patrolling outside, maybe more inside. Luca had been right when he said this was suicide. Dante did not care. He had died the moment he saw Alara's bruised face on that video. Everything else was just what came after. He checked his pistol one last time, slid 2 spare magazines into his vest pocket, and signaled his team. It was time. The first shot sounded at 3:02 when Team 1 dropped the 2 guards at the front gate with suppressed rounds. Chaos followed. Team 2 hit from the west, drawing the attention of most of the guards while Dante led Team 3 through the east side door. He was the first one through, gun raised, eyes cutting through the dark for targets. The first shooter appeared at the end of the corridor, and Dante fired before the man could shout. 1 shot, clean through the forehead. The man went down like a sack of sand, blood splattering the brick wall behind him. Dante stepped over the body without looking down, pushing deeper into the warehouse. This was not the Dante Alara knew. Not the man who left food on her desk every morning. Not the man who held her in his sleep and whispered her name like a prayer. This was the creature Giovanni Moretti had molded. A weapon honed since childhood. A killer who did not understand hesitation and did not recognize mercy. He moved through the warehouse like death itself, precise and brutal, every bullet finding a home. 2 gunmen charged toward him from the stairs. He shot them both before they could raise their weapons. Another sprang out from behind a stack of crates. Dante twisted aside, feeling the bullet graze his shoulder, then put 3 rounds into the man's chest. Blood, gun smoke, screams, bodies hitting bare concrete. Dante heard none of it over the pounding in his ears and the single name beating through his skull. Alara, Alara, Alara. The stairs to the basement were at the end of the hallway, guarded by Nikolai and 2 more gunmen. When he saw Dante, Nikolai smiled that cruel smile, the scar on his face writhing like a live snake. "So you came, Moretti," he growled, lifting a shotgun. "Boss said you would. You should have listened and given up those parts of Brooklyn. Now the girl dies, and you do too." Dante did not answer. He simply shot. The first bullet tore through Nikolai's shoulder, spinning him back. The second hit his gut. The third slammed into his chest. Nikolai went down, blood bubbling from his mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. The other 2 swung their guns toward Dante, but Luca and 2 men from Team 3 had already flanked them from behind. Gunfire ripped through the narrow space, and both went down. Dante did not stop to see if Nikolai was truly dead. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. The basement was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of blood and mold. And in the middle of the room, under a single yellow bulb hanging from the ceiling, Ilara sat, tied to a metal chair, her wrists chained behind her back, her mouth free now but her lips swollen and split. Her face was more bruised than in the video, dried blood crusted at the corner of her mouth, but her pale green eyes were wide and burning when they found him. Dante wanted to run to her, wanted to drag her up and out of this place, away from all of it. He did not get the chance, because from the shadows behind her, Roman Volkov stepped out, a pistol aimed straight at her head. "Stop right there, Moretti." His slow Russian baritone filled the basement. "Drop the gun, or that pretty little skull hits the floor before you can blink." Dante froze, his weapon still raised, sight locked on Volkov, but the angle was wrong, and Volkov was standing directly behind Ilara, using her as a shield. One wrong move, one wrong shot, and Dante could hit her instead. Volkov laughed, a dry sound like breaking bone. "Look at you," he said. "Dante Moretti, the cold wolf of Manhattan, an empire worth billions, and now you stand here shaking over a maid." He pressed the barrel into Ilara's temple, and she flinched but did not scream. "An empire for a maid," Volkov sneered. "Your father would be ashamed." Dante did not answer. His eyes met Ilara's, and for a heartbeat he saw her give the smallest nod, almost invisible. Then she moved. Ilara had spent the entire night working at the ropes. Her wrists were raw and bleeding from the friction, but she had finally loosened them, and while Volkov was busy gloating, she acted. She yanked her hands free and threw herself backward with everything she had, slamming the metal chair into him. He staggered, stumbling away, and in that instant the gun barrel left her head. 1 second, only one, but enough for Dante. He fired. The first shot hit Volkov in the chest, sending him crashing backward. The second went straight through his forehead, ending it. Volkov hit the concrete and lay there, his steel-gray eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, and they would never close again. Dante rushed to Ilara, dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands shaking as he worked the last knots from the ropes around her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough and frayed. "Are you hurt?" Ilara looked at him, her bruised eyes still bright, and gave him a small, crooked smile through her split lips. "I knew you would come," she whispered. "I never doubted it." Dante pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly it was as if he were afraid she might vanish if he loosened his grip even a little. And for the first time in his life, the feared Mafia boss of Manhattan wept. Dante did not know how long he held Ilara in that blood-soaked basement. It might have been a few minutes. It might have been an hour. Time lost its meaning as long as he could feel her body in his arms, warm and alive, trembling but still breathing. Around them were corpses and pools of blood, the stink of gunpowder and death. But Dante saw nothing except the tangle of her reddish-brown hair beneath his chin, smelled nothing but the faint lavender that somehow still clung to her skin beneath the iron scent of blood and sweat. At last, Luca appeared in the doorway, his voice softer than usual. "Boss, we have to go. The police will be here in 15 minutes. Dante nodded without a word and lifted Ilara in his arms as if she were the most precious thing in the world. She did not protest, did not say she could walk by herself. She only wrapped her arms around his neck, laid her head on his shoulder, and let him carry her out of hell. In the car on the way back to Manhattan, Ilara sat beside Dante, her head resting on his shoulder, eyes turned toward the window where the streetlights streamed past like falling stars. She stayed silent for the first half hour, and Dante did not press her. He only held her hand in his thumb tracing small circles over the back of her fingers, feeling the pulse beating beneath that fragile skin. Then she spoke, her voice rough and so soft he had to lean closer to hear her. "How many people did you kill tonight?" Dante did not answer right away. He looked down at her hand in his, that small hand marked by raw red scratches around her wrists where the ropes had bitten into her. 11, he said at last, his tone flat. "Maybe 12. He was not sure because he did not count while he was shooting, did not stop to see who was still breathing. He just fired and kept moving, like a machine built for a single purpose. Ilara was quiet for a while. Then she lifted her head and looked at him. "Aren't you afraid I will be afraid of you?" she asked, those pale green eyes searching his face. "After seeing you like that? After knowing you can kill 11 people without blinking?" Dante met her gaze, and for the first time since this began, he let the weariness show. "I am afraid," he admitted, his voice barely more than breath. "I am afraid you will look at me and see the monster I really am. I am afraid you will run and never look back. I am more afraid of losing you than I am of dying." Alara studied him for a long moment, then raised her hand and laid her palm against his cheek, her thumb brushing a streak of dried blood he did not know belonged to whom. "I am not afraid," she said, her voice so steady it stole his breath. "I knew you would come. From the moment they shoved me into that car, I knew you would find me and come for me. I never doubted that." She tilted her head, a tiny smile ghosting over her split lips. "And that monster you are talking about?" she said softly. "That monster killed 11 people to save me. I think I can live with that." 3 days passed. 3 days in which Alara lay in Dante's bedroom, tended by the Moretti family doctor, given painkillers and antibiotics, watched over by Dante almost 24 hours a day. The bruises on her face faded from purple to yellow, the swelling in her lips went down, and her eyes were no longer puffed, though dark shadows still lingered beneath them from too little sleep. She healed faster than Dante expected, or perhaps she was simply used to healing, used to being knocked down by life and pulling herself back up again. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, when Alara pushed herself up in bed and said she wanted to go out and walk because she could not bear lying still any longer, Dante knew the time had come. He sat down beside her on the bed and set a thick envelope on her lap without saying anything. Alara looked at it, then at him, her brows knitting in confusion. She opened the envelope, and what she saw froze her in place. A check for $2 million, signed by Dante Moretti, a new passport, with her face but another name, Elena Brooks, and a first-class plane ticket to Paris, departing the next day. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dante did not look at her. He stared out the window where Manhattan lay bathed in late afternoon light, and spoke in a steady tone as if he were reading a business report. "Your freedom," he said. $2 million is enough for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life if you manage it well. A new passport, a new identity. No one will ever be able to find you. Paris, because you once said you wanted to see the Eiffel Tower, and because you will be safe there. No mafia, no guns, no blood, just you, and the life you deserve." Alara looked down at the check in her hand, then up at Dante. He still would not look at her. His jaw clenched so tight the muscle in his cheek jumped. The way she had learned meant he was holding something fierce inside. "You are sending me away?" she asked quietly. "I am giving you a choice," Dante answered, still turned to the window. "A choice you have never had. You can stay here with me, in this world of blood and danger. Or you can go, start over, live the ordinary life you deserve. I will not keep you if you want to leave." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice wavered just enough for her to hear it. "But I need you to know that if you stay, there will always be another enemy. There will always be danger. I cannot promise you will be safe. I can only promise that I will die before I let anyone touch you again." Silence spread through the room. Alara looked at the check, at the passport, at the ticket. Then she looked at Dante, the man who had paid off her debt, who had pulled her out of Volkov's hands, who had given her a job and a home and a love she had never believed she deserved. The man sitting there with his shoulders tight and his hands clenched, waiting for her to decide whether or not to break his heart. She looked again at the check, the neat black ink drawing out that sum of $2 million. $2 million. Enough to live without worrying about rent or food. Enough to buy a small apartment in Paris, to study art like she had dreamed of when she was 17, to start over with a new name and a new life. No more shadow of Volkov. No more fear of being watched. No more waking up in the night to the sound of gunfire in her dreams. She could be free, truly free, for the first time in 28 years. All she had to do was take the check, board the plane, and never look back. She glanced at Dante, still turned away, braced for a blow. He had handed her everything she needed to walk away. He had opened the door and told her she could step through. He had not even asked her to stay. And that, more than anything, told her how deeply he loved her. She looked back at the check. Then she did the one thing Dante never expected. She tore it. Not once, then stopping. She ripped it in half, then tore those halves again, and again, until the check for $2 million was nothing but tiny scraps of paper like snowflakes in her hands. She let them fall, watched them drift down over the white blanket, scatter across the wooden floor, lying everywhere like funeral petals for the old life she was giving up. Dante spun around at the sound of paper ripping, his gray eyes widening in pure shock. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice raw. "That is $2 million. That is your freedom. That is—" Alara did not let him finish. She rose from the bed, stepped through the paper scraps on the floor, and stopped in front of him with barely a few inches between them. "I am not going anywhere," she said, her voice so sure there was no room for doubt. "I don't need Paris. I don't need a new name. I don't need $2 million or anything inside that envelope." She lifted her hand and laid it against his chest, right over the heart that was beating wildly beneath his shirt. "I choose to stay. I choose you." Dante stared at her as if she had started speaking a language he did not know. "You don't understand," he said, his voice almost pleading. "It is dangerous here. Volkov is dead, but there will be others. There will always be someone who wants my head, someone who wants to destroy what I built. If you stay, you will always be a target. You will never be safe." "Then we fight," Alara answered at once without a breath of hesitation. "Together, you and I. I don't need you to keep me in a glass cage like some fragile doll. I need you to fight beside me." She stepped closer, pressing both palms against his chest, forcing him to look into her eyes. "I survived my mother leaving," she said, her voice shaking not from fear but from feeling, from strength. "I survived a father who gambled away my life. I survived Derek and the police and losing my baby alone in a bar bathroom. I survived Volkov and Nikolai and 2 days chained in that basement." Her eyes shone, wet but unflinching. "I am not the maid stealing leftovers in your kitchen anymore, Dante. I am not a victim waiting to be rescued. I am your partner, in everything. And I am not going to let you push me away because you think I am too weak to live in your world." Dante looked at her. This thin woman with bruises still fading on her face, with those pale green eyes burning with a fire he had never seen in anyone. She had torn $2 million as if it were scrap paper. She had refused freedom, refused safety, refused everything anyone else would have grabbed without a second thought, just to stay with him, with the monster, with the killer. "You are insane," he whispered, his voice unsteady. "Completely insane." Alara smiled. It was the first real smile since she had been taken, the kind of smile that lit up the entire room and squeezed his heart tight in his chest. "I learned from the best," she said, and then she rose up on her toes and kissed him. This kiss was not like that first one in his office, not like the fierce kisses of the night they reached for each other. This kiss was a vow, a commitment. Two broken people who had found each other in the wreckage of their lives and decided they would rebuild, together, even if they had to walk through blood and fire and over the dead to do it. Dante framed her face in both hands, lifting her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe, and kissed her as if this were the last kiss left in the world. When they finally broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, their breaths mingling hot and uneven. He said words he had never imagined he would say to anyone. "I love you." His voice was hoarse and shaking and full of raw desperation. "God, I love you. I love you so much it makes me crazy, so much I would burn the whole world down, so much there is nothing else in my head but you." Alara lifted her hand, slid her fingers into his hair, pulled him closer. "I know," she breathed against his mouth. "I love you too. One mad soul loving another. Maybe we are perfectly matched." Dante laughed, a rough broken sound threaded with tears he did not bother to hide. Then he kissed her again, and this time both of them knew that this was only a beginning. The beginning of something beautiful growing out of the ashes of two shattered lives. 9 months passed after the night Alara tore up the $2 million check and chose to stay with Dante. 9 months in which everything changed in ways neither of them could ever have imagined. The penthouse on the 52nd floor was no longer a cold fortress of solitude. The blank white walls now held splashes of color, paintings, photographs of the two of them, caught in simple, everyday moments Dante had never believed he would have. There was laughter in the apartment every day, Alara humming songs as she made breakfast, Mrs. Callahan telling stories from the old days every Sunday when she came to visit. The silence that money could buy had been replaced by the sounds of life, of love, of family. Today, Dante stood in the doorway of the room at the end of the east hallway, a room that had once been a spare sitting room no one had ever used. Now it was being painted a soft, pale yellow, the color Alara called morning sunlight, the color of hope and new beginnings. 2 painters worked under her strict direction, and Dante could not help smiling at the way she set her hands on her hips, tilted her head, studied the wall, then shook her head and told them to redo a corner because the color was not even. She wore a loose white dress, her reddish-brown hair tied up high, and her belly round and full with 7 months of pregnancy. Their daughter, because the doctor had confirmed it was a girl, was growing strong inside her, and every time Dante laid his hand on Alara's belly and felt those small kicks, it seemed his heart might split open from sheer happiness. Alara was no longer only his analysis assistant, she was his partner in every real sense, running the entire legitimate side of Moretti Enterprises while Dante handled the rest. She had an eye for numbers even Luca had to admit was a gift. And under her management, legitimate revenue had nearly doubled in 6 months. The staff called her the lady of the house behind her back, though she always grimaced when she overheard it. She said she was just Alara, nothing more and nothing less. But Dante knew she was more. She was the heart of the empire, the light in the darkness he had lived in for so many years. Mrs. Callahan still came every Sunday, picked up by Dante's car from the nursing home and brought to the penthouse for lunch. She sat on the sofa with her hand wrapped around Alara's, telling stories from her youth no one quite knew were true or not, and she called Dante her grandson-in-law even though they were not officially married yet. Dante had proposed to Alara 2 months earlier, with a diamond ring he had chosen himself, and she had said yes with tears and laughter tangled together. The wedding would be held after their daughter was born, a small ceremony with only the people closest to them, because neither of them needed a spectacle to prove their love. Dante watched Alara scolding the painter about the uneven edge of the wall, and the memory of that very first night washed over him like a tide. The night he had stood in the dark and watched her steal leftovers into a cracked plastic container. The night he had seen her trembling as she lifted a piece of cold fat to her mouth and closed her eyes with pure relief, as if it were the finest meal on earth. That skinny girl, with the hollow eyes and collarbones jutting out like ridgelines beneath her skin. The girl who had lost everything and almost lost her life. That girl was now standing here in the room that would soon belong to their daughter, giving orders with an effortless authority, carrying his child. And she was so beautiful Dante forgot how to breathe. Alara turned, caught him watching, and a smile spread over her face. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked, walking toward him with the slightly awkward gait of a woman heavily pregnant. "Long enough to see you torment those poor painters," Dante answered, sliding his arm around her waist as she reached him. "They are painting unevenly." Alara shrugged and rested her head on his chest. "I am not accepting blotchy walls in my daughter's room." Dante laughed, kissed the top of her head, and felt their daughter kick as if in agreement with her mother. "Lunch?" he asked. "I am hungry," Alara replied at once, and they both laughed at the familiar answer. She was always hungry now, eating for two, and Dante never tired of watching her eat. Every bite she took was proof that she was alive, healthy, here with him. They walked down to the kitchen together, hand in hand, and Dante thought of the road that had brought them here. From the night he caught her stealing leftovers in his kitchen, to the night he held her in Volkov's bloody basement, to the moment she shredded $2 million to stay by his side. They had gone through hell and come back. They had lost everything and found each other. Now they were building a new life from the ashes of the old ones, a life that would soon ring with the sound of a child's laughter, with shared breakfasts every morning, with a love strong enough to heal every wound. Even the things that break most completely can be pieced together into something beautiful. That was the lesson Alara and Dante had taught each other, that the past does not have to define the future, that darkness cannot last forever if you find your own light, that love, even when it comes late, even when it arrives in the most unlikely places and people, can still change everything. The story of Dante and Alara ends here, but the lessons inside it remain. Lessons about resilience, about refusing to give up no matter how many times life knocks you down. Lessons about love, that sometimes it comes from where you least expect it, from someone you never believed could be meant for you. And lessons about forgiveness, forgiving others, and, more importantly, forgiving yourself. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the very last moment. If you feel it has touched your heart, we would be grateful if you would subscribe to our channel, click like, and share this video so we have the strength to bring you more moving stories every day. How did this story feel to you? Have you ever lived through a time when you thought you could not possibly go on, yet somehow you still found a light at the end of the tunnel? Please share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. We would truly love to hear what is in your hearts. Finally, we wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and a peaceful day, every day. Remember, no matter how hard life becomes, there is always hope ahead. There is always someone who loves you, and you are worthy of happiness. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.